What makes the greats great? What makes the successful successful? What makes the brilliant brilliant? Our Tuesday meetups with the celebrities of pharma industry and science are your one-stop shop to all these answers and more. Join us for Pies of Life, an initiative of the Biopatrika Industry Mentorship Program, where we bring your dream mentors to you.
So, Marilyn, thank you so much for coming, and it's a pleasure to sort of work. We haven't really worked personally together when we were at Amgen, but we used to go to the EDNO meetings and used to hang out together. We have a common set of friends, and so we know each other's work. And so thank you again for coming. So I think the way we'll format it is Marilyn will tell a little bit about her background and maybe some of the work that she's done for maybe 10, 15 minutes. And then we'll open it up for question and answers. And we might go a little bit over the hour, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So Marion, over to you.
Okay. So let's see. So I worked at Amgen. So I worked in the pharmaceutical industry over 35 years. I'm a toxicologist by training. I had my doctorate in toxicology. I grew up, so if you want to know where my accent is from, to get that off the table so it's not a distraction, I grew up in New York City, in Queens and Long Island, and went to the City University of New York, Queens College undergraduate, and then St. John's for graduate school. And the company I worked for a couple of companies in New York. They're all gone. They're actually all part of Pfizer now. So I never actually worked for Pfizer. In 1995, I was working in Pearl River, New York, which is up in Rockland County, if any of you are familiar with that area. And it was Ledley Labs at the time in toxicology, and they got taken over by Wyeth Erst. And I got recruited out to Amgen, 1995, small biotech company. Have to say a little bit reluctant to go to California, being sort of a New York City girl and a lifelong Met fan. But anyway, 26 years later, we're still here. So obviously it worked out. I worked at Amgen for 20 years. Toxicology, the first 10, was the head of the department. And then I moved over to regulatory affairs and did a number of different roles there. I actually built from scratch an early development focus group. Ran medical writing, was a TA, therapeutic area head for inflammation. Then I did an international assignment where I helped Amgen build its emerging markets organization, which was the best job I've ever had in my life. Completely unsustainable, just in terms of like you're basically working 25 hours a day, 7 days a week. But anyway, it was just wonderful to really, travel the world and meet people everywhere. I was based in London, but I always felt like I was more in airports and planes. But so I did that for about 2.5 years. And then I came back to Thousand Oaks here in California and was the head of US regulatory for, I guess, a little over 2 years when I hit sort of all the magic numbers and retired. And I've been consulting in sort of the regulatory toxicology, drug development space for the last 6 years. I'm also adjunct at USC, University of Southern California. I actually did an additional master's degree there. So when I moved from toxicology to regulatory at Amgen, I was like the expert in toxicology for biologics at the time, so I really felt confident in what I knew. And then I went to regulatory and I felt like I don't know anything. Like people would ask me, how many days do you need to file a briefing book before a meeting? And so one of the people working for me said, oh, they have these courses at USC. They have at the time they only had a master's, not only, but they had a master's in regulatory science. And so I said, oh, I'll take a class or two. And I wound up doing the degree. And then they actually they have a doctorate there also. And so now I teach, I'm adjunct there. And I started doing some undergraduate classes in the last couple of years. USC now has a minor in drug development for undergraduates to try to build a pipeline of students who are, pre-med, pre-dental, pre-pharmacy, but also to try to just, a lot of business development people as well, people who want to, create new small biotech companies, et cetera. So I teach a class called Mysterious Deaths and Poisoning in History and Literature. So that's my fun class. I also do some lecturing in a basic drug development, drug discovery course, probably more like what you guys have been studying, where I talk about toxicology and things like that. But I guess that's kind of it. That's that's what I do. Most of my consulting is in the biotech area. I've do a few small molecule projects, but most of them are sort of like what we'll talk about today, monoclonal antibodies, antibody drug conjugates, different constructs, Fabs and FC fusion molecules. And then, over the last few years, I probably have done more and more in terms of cell and gene therapies. So I'll stop there before I sort of jump into, I just put together a couple of slides about the aducanumab approval and, the story behind it and why it's a controversy. So just to sort of tee us up, and then we can just chat and you can ask questions and we can chat about why is it controversial, which is, I really think, the most fun part. But if you have any questions about me first, before I start with the slides, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I'm going to moderate. I definitely want to hear about the Alzheimer's antibody. So I'm going to make sure that we have enough time for discussing that properly. But please go ahead and ask Mary-Ellen questions. Just
share this couple of slides I put together. Just really just talk about the process. Okay, so what is this molecule? So aducanumab, it's a mouthful, right? All these MABs. So when you see MAB at the end of a generic name, that tells you it's a monoclonal antibody. I didn't put all the initials after it. It actually has a whole bunch of letters, which is what they're doing now with biologics so that they can differentiate between the original approved molecule and biosimilars. Okay, so what is this? It's a IgG1 monoclonal antibody that targets beta amyloid, which is, seen as one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. So this is the actual indication from the package insert. I also have the package insert up teed up on my desktop. So if we want to talk about any of the specifics, we can jump to that as well. But like I said, I just put together a couple slides just to kind of set the stage. So as the package insert says, it's an antibody against beta amyloid, and it's indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. That's not the indication that I think most people would have guessed it would have been. People, I think, thought it would be for a particular subpopulation, more likely early onset or early stage, because that's what was actually studied in the clinical trials. This indication has been approved on an accelerated approval. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. You may know all this, but I'll just so we can sort of talk about why that's controversial too. I think a lot of people didn't expect that. They thought it would be, a full approval, perhaps for a smaller population. But it's an accelerated approval. I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Based on a reduction in amyloid beta plaques. So this means that patients have to be imaged. Technically, I guess they can also do some kind of biopsy samples, but generally patients are imaged with PET imaging or MRI imaging, and then they can be treated with this. And then continued approval for this indication may be contingent on verification of clinical benefit and confirmatory trials, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So any questions on the wording of the indication? Okay, why is there so much controversy? So why am I here today? Why are you interested in this? All right, there are 30, 40 drugs approved a year. Why are we talking so much about this? Why is this on the front page of the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post? What is this all about? Okay, so there are currently in the United States about over 6 million patients who have been diagnosed or estimated to have some stage of Alzheimer's disease. There are a number of advocacy groups, the big one being the Alzheimer's, forget the exact name of the group, but anyway, there's a big, there's several groups, but there's a big one that's, an Alzheimer's group that applauds the decision. So they think this is great. We'll talk about a little more about that in a minute. Then there are, of course, people who are sort of what I call FDA watchers. So they watch the decision process, they sort of guess, they make bets in a way, but some of them do this by buying stock or selling stock of companies, right, that have pending approvals. But many of the sort of people who do this, not so much because of the stock, but to sort of watch what the FDA is doing, how many drugs are they approving, how long is it taking, that kind of stuff. So the FDA watches have probably been a little more critical of the process. As I said, the label was broader than expected. The patient population that was in the phase 3 trials was generally a patient set that's earlier than sort of all 6 million patients, right? Probably people expected it would be more focused on 1 to 2 million of patients who were in the earliest stage of disease. There were 7 clinical trials that were conducted in support of the approval. There were phase 2 range finding studies and 2 phase 3 studies. And with a 12-month treatment period. Okay, so the surrogate marker is actually the plaques. So no doubt plaques were decreased, but the clinical outcome data was not as clear. So in the 2 phase 3 trials, one of the trials indicated some clinical benefit and the other trial didn't. So when the FDA has sort of a controversial approval, one of the things they do is go to what's called an advisory committee meeting. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And those advisors, you know, if you've not gone to an advisory committee meeting or not watched one and you're interested in drug development or the regulatory process, I would definitely say watch them. There were some great ones last year and early this year on the COVID vaccine approvals. You know, that was interesting because those were all by Zoom. Everybody was on Zoom, including the FDA and the committees members, but it's really a great way to learn about drug development. So the advisory committee meeting, generally the FDA will get up and sort of present the situation. They'll go over the data from their perspective. The company will get up and give their presentation. They'll go over the data from their perspective. Then perhaps there'll be people who participate in the clinical trials. So some of the physicians who worked in the trial may present. Then there's a public open forum where often patients or patient advocates will get up at the public hearing part of the meeting. And then there'll be a big discussion time. So the FDA will usually pose questions to the advisory committee members. Usually one of the questions is, do you agree on, you know, that this drug should be approved for whatever the indication is? The FDA is generally known to follow what the advisory committee says, but not always. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so this was based on a surrogate marker. That's why it's an accelerated approval as opposed to full approval. Biogen has several years, and actually this caused some controversy as well, as they have till 2029 to conduct the follow-up trials. So it may not get full approval to 2030. Personally, I don't think that's necessarily all that long. This is 2021, the time it gets to a protocol through the approval process, get clinical trials set up. That all takes, you know, some time. And in order to actually show clinical outcomes, that's going to take several years, right? So it took 12 months to show a decrease in plaques, at least, to show actually that leads to patients actually having some better cognition or less decline in memory, et cetera, is going to take, you know, more than a year or two. So I'm not really surprised by this, but at a press conference that Biogen had the day or two after the approval, the CEO kind of, you know, mentioned it like, oh, we have 9 years to conduct this study. And I heard the FDA wasn't happy about that because they think they felt like the company made it sound like they had time to go slow. But I don't think in reality, that's all that slow. Okay, so why, again, were patients and everybody so excited about this? That's because there aren't many drugs approved for Alzheimer's. Technically, there are only 5 drugs who've been approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. 4 of them are cholinesterase inhibitors, and 1 is an NMDA receptor agonist, mementamine, which is the last one that was approved in 2003. So you can see here's, I just put the approval dates here for your reference. But 2003 is, you know, like 18 years ago. So it's been 18 years since any drug has been approved for Alzheimer's disease. So as you can imagine, you know, if you're a patient or if you have a family member who's a patient, you'd be very anxious to have a potential in a treatment. And of course, this is a completely different mechanism in terms of how it works than the cholinesterase inhibitors or the memantine is. So, okay, let's get to some of the, I already teed up some of the issues. I'll just kind of go through what I sort of wrote down today is sort of what I think the key issues are, and then we can just chat. So the first issue is it efficacious? So that sort of depends somewhat on your view of the amyloid hypothesis, right? Are plaques or reductions in plaques going to lead to a better or delayed decline or better outcomes? Is it going to have some clinical benefit? So, you know, the FDA put out a number of documents in the last week or two, basically saying, yes, they believe that's the basis by which they gave the accelerated approval. So the surrogate is the plaques, and the outcome, the clinical outcomes down the road will be, you know, all these things like cognition and slower decline in memory and you know, all the tests that we do for Alzheimer's. Okay, so when they had the advisory committee meeting over a year ago on the approval, so Biogen filed for approval, and the FDA convened this advisory committee meeting, and the advisory committee panel reviewed the two studies. As I said, one study showed some slight increase in clinical outcomes. Both studies showed decrease in plaques, but the second study, you know, didn't show much. And so all these FDA watchers and the stock watchers, in terms of do you buy Biogen stock or not, you know, had a lot of discussion about, well, what does this mean? Well, interesting enough, the advisory committee basically voted against approval. I think it was 8-1. So only one person voted for approval. In light of that, when the approval came out, I guess about 2 weeks ago now, a week and a half ago, 3 of those members resigned from the committee. So, you know, that committee sits in that therapeutic area, and they get pulled together or called into the FDA, you know, as drugs come up for approval. And some of them did it quite, you know, made a sort of a splash. They wrote editorials in the papers, or they, you know, gave interviews about why they resigned. I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think, you know, the general context was, well, why are we on an advisory committee meeting? You don't, you know, you ignored what we said. We felt strongly that this drug doesn't actually have clinical benefit. You never asked us about accelerated approval. That was not a topic for discussion. So that's why, you know, when I went back to a couple slides ago and I talked about how this was approved on an accelerated approval, that was a surprise, because that wasn't one of the questions. Now, maybe people at Biogen and people at the FDA, you know, had been talking about that in the last few months. I imagine they had. I don't think it was a surprise that, I'm sure that was not a surprise that day to Biogen, but clearly they hadn't sort of tipped their hat to the public that was what was coming. So that's, you know, the one thing. The second is, as I said, this whole idea of accelerated approval. Accelerated approval has largely been used for oncology. Probably the classic example is decreased tumor size. Does that in the end lead to, you know, improvements in outcomes, those being, you know, progression-free survival or overall survival? You know, do patients live longer, et cetera? You know, shrinking a tumor does not necessarily lead to that, but that's often what we use for the sort of the surrogate marker. Other ones are, you know, the way that the HIV, you know, early drugs were approved. Protease inhibitors, you know, approved on surrogate markers, CD4 counts and things like that. So there haven't been as much use of surrogate markers as I think some of us in general had hoped. So in some ways, this is a positive. This is maybe opening up, you know, the use of surrogate markers for additional diseases. I don't think any drug has been approved in neurology by a surrogate marker. So, you know, maybe something like ALS, which, you know, has a much faster clinical progression. You know, maybe there are some markers, who knows? But it sort of opens a door to a new set of possibilities. So that, you know, is somewhat controversial. Of course, one of the concerns is if patients can now, because the indication is so broad, it just says Alzheimer's disease. So back to this slide again, it says indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't say for patients with early stage on Alzheimer's disease or patients with, you know, some criteria, it just says Alzheimer's disease. So if every patient who has Alzheimer's disease can get this drug, will anybody go on a clinical trial, right? Because the only way to run this clinical trial is to have patients on placebo, right? So, that's one of the controversies. Who will use it, who will not? Will all 6 million patients who, have Alzheimer's disease, they could be eligible? Likely that's not going to happen. One, just because I think insurance companies, because there's a lot of controversy about this, will break the bank for Medicare and Medicaid. But the cost that's been set is $56,000 a year. So I rambled a lot, but I wanted to sort of tee up some of these issues. There's been a few good articles. I don't know if any of you do listen to podcasts. I know you're all super busy, but in the last year with the gyms closed, I got into walking, and with walking, I started listening to podcasts. And there's a podcast called the Read Out Loud. It's run by STAT, S-T-A-T, which is sort of a biotech pharma newsletter, or it's really, I guess, a newsletter that's put out by the Boston Globe. So I subscribe to STAT. That costs money, but they have a podcast that's free called the Read Out Loud. You can probably find it on Apple or Stitcher or whatever you listen to. But they did a really interesting interview with a number of different people last week on this approval, including one of the early HIV/AIDS ACT Out advocates who had pushed for accelerated approval as a new process. And he was not actually very much in favor of this. So anyway.
Yeah.
So that's something you can listen to. Yeah.
If you can unshare your slides, then we can look at, and then maybe we can.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, please go ahead, and I think anything.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Jade.
Hi there, this is Jade.
Hi, Jade.
Mary, nice to meet you. Oh, sorry, I didn't have my view. Hello.
Mary Ellen, you go with Mary Ellen, right? That's how.
Generally, Mary Ellen. Yeah, I come from a family of Marys, so everybody uses that middle name.
Okay. Yeah. I'm used to calling you Mary Ellen, that's why.
Yeah, most people call me.
Just make sure, yeah.
I kind of want to know, how do you get Alzheimer's patients on clinical trials? Because they can't decide it for themselves, can they? Or do they? Well,
I guess that will depend on the stage, right?
Yeah.
So if they have early, if they're still sort of early, they've been newly diagnosed, they probably can. But if they get to a certain stage where they're considered somewhat not competent to make those decisions, then they have to have, an advocate of some sort. Generally, it would be a spouse or a child that would then have to probably get power of attorney or some, or a doctor would have to say this patient's not mentally competent. It's just the same as with a child on a clinical trial, right? A child, at some age, a 15-year-old could probably make that, give consent, informed consent. So it's really a question whether the patient can give informed consent, right? So it would be the same process. If a patient has, for some reason, can't give informed consent, then somebody would have to do that on their behalf.
Okay, so is this drug for all stages of AD?
Well, that's one of the surprises, because the trials had been done only in patients that were fairly, early in the disease progression. But the label just says Alzheimer's disease. So that was, so that'll be then up to the insurance companies and Medicare and Medicaid, whether they'll reimburse for it, right?
Right.
Yeah. I had Marian, I generally don't ask questions, as most people know. I want them to ask questions, but there's one question I do want to ask because of related to the comment that you made. So there is a regulatory approval, the package, your BLA package. After approval, there is an entire package that is a sort of the health economic package, which is submitted to, let's say, insurance companies, all of that. Have you worked on those?
Yeah, health assessment. HTAs, they're called health technology assessments.
Yeah. And just if you can preface that to the audience here and tell them what that is, maybe that'd be perfect.
Yeah, so that sort of takes the FDA approval, sort of the next step, and what the people who work on those have to do is then take all of that information and, this is one of the reasons why drug companies push so hard to get these phase 3 trials published in big journals like Lancet and JAMA, because that sort of helps make the data seem more stronger. But then they have to take that and sort of say, well, this is why we think you should pay for it now, because it will do whatever. It will extend patients' lives. It will, perhaps for a disease like Alzheimer's, if patients are more competent, maybe they don't need as much support systems. They might be able to take less of some other drug. Obviously, there's the quality of life. There's another thing called QALYs. It's a quality of life assessment. So how much is your life worth at certain stages and things like that. So anyway, all of that is put together in what's called a health technology assessment. I didn't actually ever write those, but I did when I ran, when I was leading US regulatory, we did have a group of people that had to review those, because there are all kinds of regulations on what you can and cannot say in those. You can't sort of go beyond, either what's published or what's in the regulatory approvals.
No, thank you. Yeah. Please continue the questions.
I'll mention that what we don't have in this country is kind of an oversight board over the industry in general. So, in some countries, like in England, they have a group that's called like NICE, which now I'm going to forget what stands for, national something. But there are these different countries have these organizations that then, after a drug is approved by the regulatory agency, will then say whether or not they're going to reimburse it. That's particularly in countries where medicine is socialized and it's the government that pays, for the drugs, or like the NHS, the National Health Service in England, for example. And so then that gets decided. What we do have here is a number of big insurance payers, what we call payers. But of course we have Medicare and Medicaid. So there's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid CMS services that then make similar decisions. But that's only for patients who have either Medicare or Medicaid. Patients who have private insurance, then a company has to sort of make that assessment to those Blue Shield, Blue Cross, Aetna, all those different insurance companies, all those payers.
Yeah.
We don't have a single board in this country. But one of the things that happened last week after this big controversy with this drug, and they priced it at $56,000 a year, there were people saying, oh, well, this is what we need to do in the US. We need to set up a NICE or the same kind of thing. ICER, I think, is one of the ones in Europe. And, we need to set up a organization like that to decide, how much should we be paying for these drugs. And, that could take us down a whole nother path of who pays for drugs and how much.
Yeah, that'll be such an interesting thing to watch, given the given the completely polar political climate we have today in our country. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Hi, Mary. Thank you for sharing this information. I have two questions.
Wait, Sumit, introduce yourself because you didn't. Just 2 lines. Yeah.
So I'm Sumit, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Delaware, and I work in the area of like glycosylation analysis of monoclonal antibodies.
Okay.
So I have 2 questions. One is, like you said, there are 5 drugs that are already there for treating Alzheimer's, right? And not 100% effective, and that's why all this thing came up for this approval of this MAB. The question is, like, this MAB is also not 100% effective, right? Because, like you said, in one of the clinical trials, it showed positive results, and another it was not as encouraging as the first one. So in that case, why would one go for this accelerated approval pathway for this drug? Because you're not sure whether it is going to work. Already you have 5 drugs in market, and why should the FDA approve such a drug in the first place? And second,
is like, go ahead.
Is there any safety features of this drug which is superior to the existing 5 drugs that are in the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 5 drugs that are approved, in some ways, it's almost like 2 drugs because 4 of them are cholinesterase inhibitors. They kind of all work by the same mechanism, and only one works by the NMDA mechanism. So it's not that there's a lot of drugs, and none of them really are very effective. I don't think any of them have shown to really have a real impact on the quality of life of patients at the time. They maybe delay progression a bit, but I don't think any of them are considered to be really all that effective. It's maybe just an improvement of a few months. So that's one issue. So clearly something more is needed. That's why the Alzheimer's Disease Association has been pushing so hard for additional approvals. A lot of whether or not you think this is worth doing goes to whether or not you believe the amyloid hypothesis, right? Are tangles, clearly patients who have Alzheimer's disease have plaques and tangles. How is it a direct line correlate between how many plaques you have and how your cognition has been, how your cognition declines or not? And that, I think is somewhat still a bit of an open question. Clearly the FDA, whether they all believe this or not, I can't say, but those who signed off on these letters, clearly state that they believe that the amyloid plaque is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. It's allowed for diagnosis, until the imaging work about 10 years ago was sort of shown to correlate with the disease. The only way to really diagnose Alzheimer's was upon death, from autopsies showing that there were plaques in the brain. We didn't really have a good way until the imaging was, shown to correlate with that. So if you believe that the imaging data all these years, that correlates with disease progression, then you would think that decreasing the number of plaques or stopping the buildup of more plaques would have a positive effect. It's just that the trials in terms of clinical outcomes were, a bit mixed, but they clearly showed a decrease in plaques. I will say that from what I've read. I mean, I've not read the images myself, but from what I've read about the trials. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, but one of the things that I have read about the Alzheimer's research is that there's a big issue of finding good controls when you do this kind of study. And generally people without Alzheimer's disease, they also with the age, they develop these plaques. So I don't know like how confident is that hypothesis of this amyloid plaques true for Alzheimer's disease?
Yep, I don't disagree. That's why it's somewhat controversial, right? That's where some people, that's clearly one of the reasons also why the advisory committee voted 8 no and 1 yes, right? Because I think partly not only what did they feel that the trials were not the definitive, I think there's probably some controversy within the field as to whether this is the definitive hallmark or not.
And whether
I just wanted to oh, go ahead, Sumit. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Whether this map has any improved safety attributes.
Oh, you asked about safety, yes. Yeah. So the one thing I will say, so the cholinesterase inhibitors definitely have some side effects. I mean, cholinesterase inhibitors are used, they're pesticides too, right? And they cause all kinds of neurodegeneration over time, if you're exposed the wrong way, not at the doses that are used here, but obviously too much is not a good thing. They have their own, a lot of toxicity. So the one good thing about the Alzheimer's antibody is it has very little toxicity. So there aren't a lot of negative side effects. A few people, small percentage actually of people develop anti-drug antibodies. So it's actually pretty non-immunogenic compared to other antibodies I worked on. It's an IgG1, so it's, has pretty good half-life. Patients only have to be infused once a month. So yeah, the side effects actually, I think, as I said, I have the package insert here. Let me see if I can. No, let's see. I think I'm going to have to go back to my.
Marian, are there more questions? Are there more questions? I'll let people ask. We're running out of time, so you want to ask a question if you want to ask them.
Yeah, I was just going to show, this is the package insert here. So you can see, you know, in terms of, there's no contraindications, warnings and precautions.
Wow.
You know, there's not much hypersensitivity reactions, you know, with, as this would be in any monoclonal antibody. The most common adverse reaction, you know, was some edema, headache, you know, so pretty much not a lot. There was a few cases of diarrhea. I mean, you know, pretty innocuous compared to, certainly compared to the cholinesterase inhibitors. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to show that.
Intravenous, right? What was it?
Intravenous infusion, yeah, once a month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Jade, when you asked your question, you didn't introduce yourself besides saying your name. So I just wanted to give you a chance to say what you're studying or your interests.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jade, and I have a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology, actually. And
oh, great. We need more of you.
I'm really interested in your phone class, actually. I was interested in toxicology when I was in China, so I'm from China. And I remember I read this book. It's about like we have like 5,000 years of monarchy poisoning people that they don't like. So the book is basically about trying to make sense of what those poisons that they actually really use. Like I remember one of them is tetrodotoxin, and that was the thing that I was using.
Pufferfish?
Yeah, so it's a sodium channel blocker, and I do neurotoxicity. So it was really interesting to actually know, like, what did Julia actually take the first time and the second time. But anyway, I think toxicology is interesting. So right now I'm studying rare disease, especially in epilepsy and movement disorders. So, and I'm a second year postdoc in Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So yeah.
Great.
But
great. Nice to meet you. We'll keep in touch. Find me on LinkedIn because
I'm always,
I will. You know, yeah.
Can I actually audit your phone class?
I don't know if I have, I mean, I'm happy. I don't know whether I can give you the rights to do that, but,
okay.
But we can connect and I'm happy to share some of the information for sure.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, some good books to read and things like that. We can, yeah.
But, oh, can I ask a non-Alzheimer related question actually? So it's more about career choices. So you mentioned you did toxicology for 10 years, and why did you decide to change to regulatory side? Are you bored with toxicology, which I'm heard?
Well, you did toxicology longer than 10 years. I did it 10 years at Amgen, but I had done toxicology 10 years, you know, in New York. So previously, so so it was a long time, and I think one of the things. No, I mean, a couple of reasons. One was just to do something else. You know, you do, there were some days I remember coming in my office and I said to my administrative assistant, she'd say, oh, there's 2 protocols on your desk you have to sign. You know, I was like, one more rat, 1 month tox protocol. I can't do this anymore. So it does come to a point where, you know, I was just doing the same thing for too long. But another part of it was, the job had grown so much, I felt like all I was really doing was management. When you have like 60, 70, 80 people under you, you have, you know, I had all these directors under me and then associate directors, and it just sort of, you know, you feel like you're spending more of your time doing budgets and organizational stuff than I wasn't managing any projects myself anymore. So anyway, it was time for a change. And so that's why I moved over. I was asked to move over to regulatory. So Sean Harper, actually, who had just become the head of the regulatory at the time at Amgen was like falling apart. They had a turnover rate of like 25 to 30% of people were leaving. And so they had gone through 3 vice presidents in 6 months. And so the Sean Harper, who had been head of the medical clinical early development group, was asked to just go over to regulatory and, you know, restructure, rehire, and whatever. And because he and I had worked actually pretty closely together, because he was, you know, basically the transition from toxicology to clinical, we were sort of the, you know, my data was passing to him. He called me up and he said, on the first day, he said, I'm recruiting you just so you know, I need you to come here and help me rebuild this department and hire people. And so that's what I did. And it turned out to be a ton of fun. So anyway, and I got to work with other great people like Narendra. So yeah.
Yeah. By the
I
way,
always
any
tell
question?
people you need to do something different. You know, I mean, one of the ways you grow is by taking on something you can't. Often when young people or people mid-stage career come to me and say they have to make a decision, you know, they could do this job or that job. I mean, you have to do what you feel passionate about, but sometimes going out of your comfort zone a little bit. I mean, not so much where like you're a surgeon and now you're gonna, I don't know, play basketball for the NBA. But you know, something that's a little bit off what you were doing before is really where you learn to stretch and grow.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
Sure.
In terms of transiting to regulatory, is there a particular background or field, like other than toxicology, that would be helpful to be building, you know, sort of expertise in, that would make the transition easier or more relevant?
Well, anything to do with clinical development, you know, so some of the, you know, I mean, if you look at the FDA, what are the kinds of people they have at the FDA? Sort of reflect the kinds of people that you have in a strong regulatory department. So, you know, probably at the FDA, 25% of the people are toxicologists, 25% are sort of CMC, you know, experts, whether that be medicinal chemistry or, you know, more protein sciences, if it's in the biologics world. And then probably half of, I mean, you know, the scientific staff are doctors or PharmDs, a lot of PharmDs. So that's another area, you know, I often, if I'm talking to undergraduates and they're interested in drug development, you know, a PharmD is a great degree that can sort of help you transition into drug development in general. So, but any kind of clinical, you know, MD is obviously, you know, I mean, my bosses were almost always MD. So Sean Harper that I just talked about was an MD. What he moved up, the person who took his role was an MD, you know, that had worked at the FDA, David Feigl, and then Steve Golson, another MD. So I always felt, even though I had a PhD, I was never going to be the senior vice president of regulatory and safety at Amgen without an MD, although they just recently promoted somebody to that role who doesn't even have a PhD. So I guess I was wrong about that, but.
I think that's great. Any more career related questions or?
Yeah.
I have a comment on that actually. I always thought MD would run a hospital as well, but right now CHOP's president was a nurse, and also Boston Children's Hospital's president was an MBA. They're like never MD. I think it's kind of moving away from like the MD dominated leadership position and trying to actually specify to others.
Yeah, it's a pendulum swinging. I will say that, you know, in my field, more in toxicology, so before I got into regulatory, it kind of swung both ways in terms of being a PhD versus being a DVM pathologist. So I have a PhD in toxicology, and when I moved into toxicology, most people in the field were pharmacologists, toxicologists. I mean, there wasn't even PhDs in toxicology much before I got mine, but a lot of, you know, pharmacologists and some, at that time, a pharmacist was a bachelor's degree, but then people went on to get a PharmD that made them more clinical research. So it was a, you know, mix of people like that. And then it started moving to this idea that, you know, so pathologists, well, veterinarians who wanted to get into this field would then do a PhD in pathology. And so, you know, we always had veterinary pathologists that would read the slides for the tox studies, but then there was this movement probably in the late 80s, early 90s, where they sort of made this sort of pitch that they really should be running toxicology because a DVM pathologist was a higher degree than just a PhD like me. And so actually they sort of, and they did pretty successfully take over the whole field of toxicology in the pharmaceutical industry. And then that swung back again. So it's a pendulum that swings, you know, So I think it's the same thing with the MDs as well, is running things. I have my sister-in-law is a nurse who became a nurse practitioner, who then got a PhD in hospital administration, and now she's head of all nursing at Mount Sinai, the whole Mount Sinai system in Manhattan in New York. So she's like the highest administrative person who's a non-MD in Mount Sinai. So that kind of thing wouldn't have happened years ago, right? So do what you love. So a couple people haven't said anything. I haven't. Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask a
yeah.
question. Akshay,
Yeah.
right. So my background is I'm in process development. I worked in companies in Australia, India, and now I'm currently working in Canada. And yeah, I found your background very interesting, and the subject matter that we were discussing as well, very interesting. So I also did some work with Alzheimer's with my first company in Australia, and they were down-regulating the expression of amyloid plaques. They were trying to target it that way. Uh, I had a question about it, but I actually want to ask more about career shifting. So, as you said, you went from toxicology to regulatory. So, when you make a shift like that, would you have to consider what skills you can translate from your previous position to? In your case, did it help you also a lot to do that, to take your skills from toxicology, and then did you specialize in those aspects in regulatory?
Yeah. So that's kind of how I built my career in regulatory. So when Sean brought me over, he said, I have all these jobs I need someone to do. I want someone, he and I had talked about building an early group because we had found we were not getting the regulatory support we needed from when we were, I was rushing to get the tox work done. He was rushing to get the clinical protocols, done. And then we'd send everything in the regulatory and it would sit on someone's desk because they were under-resourced, but they also didn't have anyone focusing on early development. Everybody, it was sort of by therapeutic area. And so when you have products in the market and there's an issue that comes up, that has to be taken care of right away. You can't say, oh, I'm not going to answer this question from the FDA in my marketed product because I have a new IND I want to file. So that was one of the jobs. There were some others as well. So I said to myself, just as you were thinking, well, what's the job I could do of this list that I'm being offered that would use the current skills I have, because I knew I didn't have all those regulatory day-to-day skills, like how many days before a meeting do you need to have the briefing book into the FDA? I was going to have to learn some of that. What would, give me the strength, what strengths did I bring? And I think I had some good people strengths, which is one of the reasons why, Sean asked me to come do that. I was good at hiring people. I built, when I joined toxicology, we were like 5 or 6 people. When I left, it was like 80. So obviously, I wasn't the head in the beginning, but I became the head sort of in the middle of those years. So, hiring and organizational design were things I was pretty good at, even though, it's not as exciting, honestly, as science. But, these are things that I could bring to the table, to the regulatory table, how to hire people, how to develop people. So that's always been one of my passions, is how do you develop so that people, could become me, giving them different assignments, having them sort of move out of their comfort zones, rotate through, departments that way. So those were things that, I did. And so that helped me feel a little more grounded. And then, of course, as I said, I took on other roles. I became the inflammation therapeutic area head. That wasn't something, I probably would have been as comfortable doing the very first week, but I probably did that about 6 or 9 months into it, So as I got more and more comfortable with the day-to-day work, I took on more and more things. So, and we have one more person over here, and for me, in my right-hand corner, Tej Patel, who I haven't heard anything from, if he wants to introduce himself.
Yes, and I think Nine Uncle's trying to talk. You're on mute, Nine Uncle. Just so you know.
No. I was saying you're uncharacteristically quiet.
I was uncharacteristically quiet. Hi, Mary Ellen. So my name is Tej. So speaking of kind of just following weird career paths, I got my master's in biomedicine, and I actually joined industry straight out of that instead of pursuing a PhD. I joined a rotational program at GSK in vaccines, and I actually went from, I authored a first author paper in mitochondrial DNA in grad school, went from there to vaccines manufacturing, to vaccines health economics, to new product strategy in vaccines. Now I'm in vaccine sales. I actually had a question kind of separately about HTAs. I did some work with EQ5Ds and SF36 stuff with NICE and some HTAs with NICE pneumococcal vaccines. With these potential changes we're seeing with Biogen and these costs and things, where do you think we're going in terms of an ISA for the US, and how does someone like me kind of follow that if that is potentially happening, kind of keeping a finger on that kind of pulse?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know where it's going. I think, the whole drug pricing issue in this country, I think, has not moved as fast as I thought it would. If you had asked me about, well, when I left Amgen, I told people I thought it was kind of, I still think the heyday of the pharmaceutical industry is past us. Sort of the times where you'd have a launch and you'd have a huge party and everybody would get kinds of giveaways and all that kind of stuff for every launch. I think those kind of days are gone. There's much more, it's a keener eye on how the industry spends its money. And of course, that rolls down from people feel that people in this country spend too much money on drugs. And the more that they learn about how much they spend in other countries, that puts pressure here. So I think it's going to be, price pressure is going to be continuous, but it hasn't really moved as much as, I think some of us thought, as I said, when I left Amgen 6 years ago. Some of that's just the crazy politics that exists in the United States right now. There's just no traction. That we're so divided. Neither of the two main parties and all the sub parties and can get enough traction to get any handle on it. So in the meantime, it's sort of like the industry sort of self-regulating itself a bit, in that it's you haven't seen the price increases be as dramatic in the last few years as they were for a while, because I think companies know that if they just raise their prices or double the price from one year to the next, that they're going to get canceled or whatever. It's just going to be too controversial. So but there hasn't been as strong a movement on drug pricing. So I follow Bio. They have a daily newsletter. They talk about these kinds of issues. They do monitor. There are things like that you can monitor that will say day to day what's going on in Congress in terms of movement on drug pricing. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have tried to make some traction on that in the last few years, but as I said, there hasn't been much that's actually gained traction. Now, I don't know whether that will happen. When their price was announced last week at $56,000 a year, there were outcries again. Drugs are too high. We pay too much in the United States. Blah blah blah. We need to, but in reality, the industry is in this country does sort of underwrite the rest of the world. Sure, they pay less money for drugs in a lot of these other countries, but they also don't have as robust drug development research as we do either. Where did the COVID vaccines come from? Right? You see how quickly Moderna and Pfizer were able to get their vaccines up and running, and look at AstraZeneca. They only were as successful as they were in England because they were pretty much underwritten by the government there, but they still haven't even filed for approval yet in the US. We might get that vaccine from Cuba before we get the one from AZ.
It's interesting. It's a different type of market access issue here in the US.
We are running out of time. Unless there's a burning question. No, I can stay forever. I mean, this is a great conversation. I'll be conscious of everybody's time here.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take too much time either.
Arun, I don't know if you've asked a question. Do you want to ask a question?
I think
You have to.
no, I don't. I think there were a few questions about career transitions, but those have been discussed already. So no.
Okay.
But thank you for presenting that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So
Mary
follow
Ellen,
me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. You're all welcome to follow. No, you don't want them to follow me?
We're not done yet. We're not done yet.
Oh.
I end by the rapid fire 10 questions.
Oh.
I have one quick question. What was the name of the newsletter that you said you follow?
STAT, S-T-A-T,
Yes.
the readout. Yeah. And the podcast is the Read Out Loud. There's actually, so STAT actually does maybe it's daily or weekly, the readout, which is kind of a couple of people that they have that sort of talk more about these kind of broader issues. You know, what does this mean for the industry in general? And then the Read Out Loud is the sort of podcast version of that, some newsletter, but it's all done by STAT. So S-T-A-T.
Okay.
Can I
Sumit, did you say something? Yeah.
I just want to ask one quick question. Regarding the MAB, you said that this particular MAB that has been approved, it just required, the dosage that is required is like 1 dose per month, right? Which essentially means that it has a longer half-life. So my question is that So my question is, for this Alzheimer patients, the drug has to cross this blood-brain barrier, right? Generally, IgGs don't cross this blood-brain barrier. So is this drug developed engineered in a way that it crosses the blood-brain barrier easily and stays there to act upon those plaques? How is it?
Yeah, that's a good, yeah, I actually don't know if it's been engineered in some way or whether it's pulling the amyloid from in other ways, you know, along the sort of blood-brain barrier itself, you know, along the.
Yeah. And the other reason could be, you know, in Alzheimer's patients, the blood-brain barrier may already be compromised to a certain extent because of the disease. So that may be one of the factors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an important question.
Yeah.
All right, so let's do this. Sumit.
Just final question. I'm very curious to know.
Yeah. I'm conscious of her time also, right? Because it's 6 minutes over. Yeah. No, you can ask her. You can actually connect with her with LinkedIn and ask her 1,000 questions later on, if it's okay.
LinkedIn. And
okay.
Yeah.
No, sorry. Okay, so ready, Marianne? So what is one skill you're working on right now?
Work-life balance. I took on too much work during the pandemic.
Okay. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Early morning.
Okay. What behavior or personality trait do you attribute your success to?
I guess being open to everybody, being receptive, friendly, liking all kinds of people.
Okay. What would we most likely find you doing on the weekend?
Walking, reading. I read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Play my flute. I play the flute.
Okay, I'm not even going to go there. If you were to snap your fingers and become an expert at something, what would it be?
Oh, I'd love to know another language.
Okay. What would you tell your teenage or your younger self?
Be easier on yourself.
Okay. What's one thing that people may not know about you?
Well, I play the flute. You didn't know that, right?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
I play with a bunch of toxicologists in a group that we get together occasionally, and we call ourselves Jazz Ecology.
Jazz Ecology. Okay, I have to follow you. Follow you. Follow up on that with you or something. What's your guilty pleasure?
Pretzels.
Pretzels. Okay. If you could meet a historical figure, who would you meet?
Madame Curie.
And last question, if you had a talk show, who would you invite on that talk show?
Anthony Fauci. That's everybody wants right now. You know who I'd love to interview? So there's another podcast I listen to. It's called Clear and Vivid that Alan Alda does, where he interviews all kinds of interesting people. But I'd like to interview him.
Who?
Alan Alda? Alan Alda.
He used to be on that TV show, which has, anyway, I won't remember. I'm dyslexic, so I won't remember it. But since you mentioned it, I also learn and play the flute. Here it is.
Oh, wow. It's beautiful.
But it's a bamboo Indian flute.
Yeah. I have a glass flute that I recently, just before the pandemic, I bought, and I have been trying to work on that. Have you ever played a glass flute? It's a blown glass. It's yeah. So it's like that in that it's, fixed, right? It's just a piece of glass with holes as opposed to, a silver flute.
We should follow up on our flute.
Yeah. See?
Thank you so much. This was so enlightening, and thank you for all of you guys to come over and ask good questions and learn about what was it called?
Aducanumab. Yeah, but follow me on LinkedIn. I do try to regularly post, news on the biotech world and, some of the articles from STAT and other things like that. So, but it was a way to keep in touch. And Jade, I expect to hear from you about toxicology.
I think I sent an invitation to your friend on LinkedIn.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A network should last a lifetime. Let us help you create lasting professional relationships with our world-class mentors through the Biopatrika Industry Mentorship Program. A strategic guidance program unlike no other, full of expert interviews, industry internship opportunities, CV writing, inflection point analysis, life maps, and of course, the gateway to your dream career. For a limited time only, all our services are freely available for you, as we truly want you to succeed.